We've got a doozy here today, folks. This is from thecarguys.tv. It's an English-based channel from what I can tell. And they've got a long video here. I'm going to try to cut it up just to the bits that I think are relevant.
I should stress, of course, that I'm not a scientist. I do not have a team of researchers, and that everything I'm going to talk about is based on my own findings from credible sources.
Okay, I like that. That's a good start. I'm also not a scientist. I guess you could call me a data scientist, or I've been called that before.
When I started researching my EV episode, it was going to focus on all the ways that electric vehicles are worse than petrol cars.
Okay, so it took 3 seconds for him to go from credible sources of data, and now all I'm going to do is try to focus on the negative things and what's wrong with electric cars. I mean, he's showing his incredible bias, which, again, we all have, but I think if he actually were able to bring facts and information proving all the things that his bias that he's already trying to go at, sort of cherry-picking the data, I would be all for it. We could have a debate and talk about facts. However, I get the hunch that that might not be where his video goes.
Range anxiety, the cost of electric cars versus petrol, environmental impact, the lack of infrastructure, etc., etc. And I guess that's what you all want me to rant about as well. And also because you know you won't face the backlash from the EV evangelists. I will.
Hey there. Nice to meet you.
The whole move to electric vehicles will make no meaningful difference to global warming and the reduction of greenhouse gases if you don't address the main causes.
Well, let's talk about data first. He doesn't have any data sources listed in the description of this video, nor is he showing here any on screen. So much for the promise at the beginning of the video. But we do have data about this, and of course, guess what it shows? From the EPA in the United States, and yes, I'll cover a lot about the UK and the EU data as well, because that's where he's at, so try to make it more localized for him. But we have data here. In fact, the first biggest myth that we have is that electric vehicles are worse for the climate than gasoline cars. So EVs emit no tailpipe emissions. We do have other emissions from manufacturing of the battery and all those kind of things, but the cradle to grave emissions are far lower in every single study that I could find. Okay, now that's step one. Step two was he talked about we're not working on the source of the problem, which is how energy is created in the first place. Well, that also is not true. Back all the way in 2020, renewables have become the second most prevalent U.S. electricity source. So you can see here that coal itself is just dying a very quick death. Natural gas is really having a takeoff, which is far better for the planet than coal. So that's a win, even though it's not the perfect solution. Nuclear is still growing slightly, and then renewables are on a strong uptick. So the electricity that's being generated, which does have emissions generally speaking, with the exception of renewables, those are actually switching over to renewables, making the grid cleaner, creating a compounding effect for all the EVs that already exist out there. And if you want to put that into perspective from the MIT Climate Portal, an electric car charged on the average U.S. electricity grid creates just a third as much CO2 per mile as a similar internal combustion engine car. That's the equivalent of the gas car getting over 100 miles per gallon. And as the grid improves, the EVs are already in the road will continue to get cleaner. That's that compounding effect I'm talking about. So if you switch all the gas cars over to electric and then the electric sources get cleaner as they are, then guess what? It actually has an immediate kind of network effect throughout different communities out there, reducing air pollution and reducing overall emissions. And if you want to talk about cradle to grave emissions, there's a beautiful chart by yours truly with data pulled from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and you can see that across the lifetime here, a gas vehicle, an internal combustion engine vehicle, was about 49% more polluting, more CO2 emitted using a high GHG case for a battery electric vehicle, a high greenhouse gas case, and then 53% more for a base case where you have a mix of renewables and other sources. So what that means is that from mining the materials to decommissioning, recycling of the vehicle or scrapping the gas vehicle at the very end of it, you are looking at about a 50% reduction in overall emissions. And the folks over at the Carbon Brief actually made a really cool animated chart to show that compounding effect here. So what you have are conventional vehicles on the left, and you can see that the lifetime emissions were around 2 times lower in the UK, where our host is from, compared to an average conventional car in 2010. And what happens is because the grid gets cleaner, the emissions actually get better and better. So you can see as we play this video forward, you can see that in 2019, it's actually 3 times lower because the grid kept getting cleaner and cleaner. And in 2030, it's just going to continue to get better and better. So this is where switching to electric cars now, even if the sources are as dirty as they can possibly be, as those sources get cleaned up, it will have a much bigger impact on the environment overall.
I also agree that if internal combustion engine cars are replaced with EVs in dense cities, that this will have a positive effect on air quality.
Let's look at this argument, the air pollution one. So he agrees, rightfully so, that if you switched over to electric vehicles, you would essentially have no tailpipe emissions, lowering the overall emissions within denser urban populations. Probably out in a more rural area wouldn't have as big of an effect. So clearly in a place like London, where he's maybe near, this could be a big deal. In fact, it's such a big deal that the American Lung Association created a report here back in June of 2023, and they estimated that switching over to zero-emission vehicles, what they mean here are tailpipe emissions, would have a net benefit on the economy in the United States of $978 billion. Far more than is earmarked to actually help incentivize the adoption of electric vehicles, so it'd actually be a net profit by doing all of those incentives. So that would lead to 89,300 fewer premature deaths, 2.2 million fewer asthma attacks, and 10.7 million fewer lost workdays. So think about that for a second. If there was something that you could do that would have almost $1 trillion lift on the economy here in the United States, and this would pan out in other countries as well, why wouldn't you do it? His argument that he's agreeing with here, I think, is one of the biggest points, and hopefully more people will start talking about that, because that sort of cuts through all the other political side of it, and everybody's for the economy, at least everybody here in the US.
I have a problem that governments are ignoring the real causes of global warming in favour of easy vote-winning car bashing. I do have a problem with banning internal combustion engine cars rather than allowing it to be a personal choice, especially when any look at the data will show that they are not the problem.
Even in looking at his chart here, it looks like transport is, I don't know, what is that, maybe about 20% of it? We have data on this. I tried to find this chart. I couldn't exactly. But the data I did find actually comes to us from the EU, and it's about CO2 emissions from cars, facts and figures. There's a couple different graphics here. The one I want to show you is this guy here, which is a donut chart, not my favorite kind, but it shows basically that 71% of greenhouse gas emissions were from road transportation. Now, that's not all the transportation that exists. It's not every single car that you drive to take your kids to school. That also includes heavy-duty trucks, which it lists at 27.1%, and 11% are light-duty trucks. Now, those are also switching over to electric, and they're actually a much better kind of incentivized option, because if you think about it, in that space, nobody cares about how it looks or how fast it goes. It's, does it get the job done? Does it save me money? That's basically it, right? So if you look in the US, Amazon has something like an $8 billion order for delivery vans, and that is just the beginning of that. So that would cover your light duty trucks. Tesla is doing semis, and so the semi trucks are actually coming now. I do think that that is a much harder nut to crack, but I'll let that to the experts there. And then 60% of that 71% greenhouse gas emissions are from cars, are from the things that people drive, at least in the EU. And so right there, it is a big part of the greenhouse gas emissions. So he's wrong. The data he's showing, even the chart he showed it is a significant portion. So I hate that he just found one chart and sort of glossed over it, didn't even talk about it, didn't even cite it. He was supposed to be credible, and he was supposed to give us real data.
I'll go into how electricity is generated a little bit later, but for now it's important to clarify that unless you live in a tiny number of countries, like for example Norway, Iceland and Brazil, the electricity for your car comes largely from fossil fuels. That is unlikely to change.
But it is likely to change, and there are countless examples. There's actual legislation, obviously, governments pushing this, incentives, other kinds of things out there, and we see that it is changing.
In terms of EVs themselves, as many smart people already know, during manufacture they generate a huge amount of environmental damage, mining for cobalt, nickel and lithium, and all the other materials required.
Right. But what about what it takes to actually make petrol or diesel for your gas car? Well, guess what? There's actually a huge environmental hit there as well. As we say in the United States, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So at the MIT climate portal here, again, you can see there this exact question. The summation is that mining, whether for fossil fuels or metals used in clean energy technologies, does have serious environmental impacts, and it's hard to make apples-to-apples comparisons, except for in terms of the impact on climate change, where clean energy mining is clearly better. I'll put a link to this article, as well as everything else you're seeing on here, so you can go verify it for yourself. If there's something we missed, please let us know in the comments.
And let's not forget the human rights abuses employed to mine all the material in areas of the world that you don't like to talk about at parties.
Absolutely. Cobalt, specifically coming from the DRC, is a problem. It is something that is used so widespread. It's probably in the device that you're holding to watch this video right now, in the camera that I'm using, the camera that he's using. And before we get into that, if you do want to know more about this, my friend Joe Scott did a really good deep dive into it on a video he called The Trouble with Cobalt. I'll link to that in the description as well, so you can go have a look if you want to have a deeper, better understanding of this. But in the EV space and electric cars, we actually are making strides to avoid using these materials altogether. In Tesla's latest impact report, for example, they talk about how they're dedicated to sourcing these materials sustainably, and they're already using lithium iron phosphate or LFP batteries, which avoid these conflict materials. And so we're already making a switch there, and Rivian is also doing so, along with probably many other automakers. Apple has also stated that they will use 100% recycled cobalt in batteries by 2025. So yes, cobalt, definitely a conflict mineral that is very problematic for human rights, for tracing of where it comes from, all those things. And as a result, a lot of these companies are moving away from it. So he can try to paint this picture of this sad thing and not to belittle that and say it's not true, but definitely it has been recognized by the industry and is already on its way towards being resolved.
But let's assume you can build ethical volume electric cars by 2030 that will offer high range, quick charging, are lightweight, and don't cover people in acid when they crash.
I hope he knows that they don't have lead acid batteries in them. That's not what they're made of. He knows that, right? Now, if he's talking about fires, we have data on that as well. Our friends over at Motor Trend actually brought this to us back in July of 2023, talking about EV fires, which have actually been a lot in the news recently. And there's been a lot of kind of weird misinformation out there. There isn't a U.S. agency that actually tracks this. When they look at fires for vehicles, they don't usually track, or have never tracked previously, the source of the propulsion system, whether it be electric or hydrogen or whatever. But we do have a Swedish study that was released recently, and it shows that between 2018 and 2022, on average, 16 vehicles powered by batteries catch fire there each year. On average, 3,400 passenger vehicles catch fire each year in Sweden, meaning that EVs account for 0.4% of all passenger vehicle fires there annually. Hybrids account for 1.5%, for a combined total of 1.9% of all passenger vehicle fires. Put another way, gas and diesel-powered cars account for 98.1% of all passenger vehicle fires in Sweden each year. So the data, again, shows that EVs are safer in the case of a fire because they are just so much less likely to catch fire.
And when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions, there's only one place to start: China.
That is the worst chart I've ever seen ever. I'm going to can we blur that out? I don't want anyone's eyes. His point is that we need to work on overall emissions. Again, this is how people try to kind of bait and switch you. They want to tell you about electric cars and how they don't solve the issue, because look at the emissions of this ginormous country that is the manufacturer of all the things in the world. It's so wildly different topics to even talk about, right? But since he mentioned China, let's see how they're doing. Well, our friends over at the Carbon Brief have an analysis showing that China's emissions are set to fall in 2024 after record growth in clean energy. So it turns out that China actually is the largest electric car market on the planet and are doing huge things for renewable energy and switching over to more cleaner sources, because they see not only the overall benefits, but the localized benefits of reduced pollution and everything else. And they created a nice little chart here to project what they hope to see in 2024. And you can actually see that they've had sort of this up up and down relationship with the annual change in emissions from fossil fuels and cement. These are in the millions of tons of CO2.
I can't help but wonder if this is the dark future of EVs, when we all suddenly realise the true cost of making them, running them on fossil fuel-based electricity, and then of course trying to dispose of them. Like wind generator blades, are EVs all destined to be quietly buried in landfills?
Sorry to burst your bubble here, but EV batteries are actually very recyclable. For example, my friend Zach did a video not too long ago showing how these batteries are actually being recycled in a very efficient manner, where a lot of those metals, those conflict materials and all those other things are being recaptured towards the tune of about 90% of the material, which is tremendous. And it's actually becoming more efficient because of different things actually developed by companies like ExxonMobil, which have new chemicals and processes for recycling batteries. Now remember, batteries are not just electric car batteries. Of course, there are many more batteries and things like your phone, your camera, your laptop, tools, all kinds of stuff everywhere. So it's just not true what he's saying about this graveyard of batteries and all that. In fact, there's companies out there that take batteries and then repurpose them in other use cases. So it's one of those things where, again, he's really just kind of misleading you and lying about this and only cherry picking facts, not looking at the total picture. Not to say that manufacturing of anything doesn't have some carbon hit, but the recyclability of electric vehicle batteries is actually really, really good. So it's not going to be like any of these other things like, say, plastic.
Also increase significantly R&D for the universe's most abundant free green energy source, hydrogen, instead of betting everything on batteries.
The universe's most abundant resource is one of the most misleading statements that you could possibly make. Think about that for a second. What good does this resource on a galaxy light years and light years away do us? What does that matter? Why did they say the universes? They always say that. It seems like such a silly thing. And in fact, making hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles as it stands today mostly uses a thing that burns fossil fuels. So a quick visit to the hydrogen fuel basics over at the energy.gov website. You can find the different ways in which we make hydrogen for fuel cells. The vast majority of it is done through this process called natural gas reforming or steam methane reforming. And it is an incredibly CO2 impactful process. And I haven't seen solid data on it, but I would speculate that it's probably worse for the environment than just burning petrol or diesel at all. So it's one of those things where this has been pushed by the oil industry for a long time because guess what? It uses more of their product, makes them more money. And also it's incredibly expensive, destined to fail. There's so many issues with it actually being done in passenger vehicles. Possibly hydrogen could have a place in things like shipping or long haul trucking or aviation. I don't know. I'm not educated enough on that to make a proper assessment. But in terms of passenger vehicles, we tried it here in the US and it did not work. Maybe in the UK, which is a very small place compared to the US, maybe that's it. But there's a lot of advantages to being in a smaller country where the infrastructure demands are much smaller than, say, the United States, which is just gigantic in comparison. And that was a doozy. Thank you for sticking with me. We hit basically every big myth out there about electric vehicles. There's links to everything I talked about down in the description, just below the link to my new daily podcast you can check out about electric vehicles. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe down below because this journey of fighting this fear, uncertainty, and doubt with facts and information is one that's going to take all of us. So I really appreciate you being here with me because remember, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And we know the internet doesn't need any more of those. That's it for this one, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you back here next time.